Cool. So we are talking today about buyer experience deployments. The reason being is I did a bunch of work on this like last year, and it's documented, and other people worked on it as well. But this was a lot of stuff where like I did it once. And now it is like it just works, which I think is great. I'm proud of, but also I am leaving GitLab, and so this video will just be some good documentation, and we talked about like we're going to go through kind of like we're going to look at a recent deployment. Oh, hey, look at that! Looks like Nathan did something over here, so maybe we can walk through Nathan's recent merge and sort of talk about like where everything's going and how it's wired up, and then answer questions there. So because I don't think this is unlikely to change in a lot of ways. I think the nice thing is this works pretty well, scales pretty good, and like I also haven't tinkered with this in a long time because I think we just kind of like got it kind of right, which is great. So cool. So let's look at this pipeline. So the nice thing is, so actually let's do a couple things here. So at a top level, all of this is controlled by like all the source of truth here is in this buyer experience repository. The stuff that we're going to look at is all defined in this YAML file, right? Like if you want to investigate what's going on, like nothing happens in the pipeline without this for the most part. And like this is where you would go to change things as well. So this is just conventional GitLab CI. That's all documented in GitLab documentation. Unfortunately, we work here at GitLab, so I think if you're experiencing challenges with it, you have a lot of access to the right people to ask questions. So I think that's a huge virtue for this project. So we don't have to like read through the YAML necessarily. We might do a little bit, but so there's this pipeline. This pipeline is running on main, and it looks like it's Nathan merging an MR to clarify OSS language into main. And so, every time, basically, anytime something gets merged into main, like this merge request, right, it will kick off this pipeline. And there's a bunch of different stages. So there's the install stage, which installs our dependencies, and they're just named basically what you see in there. So here's the install stage, right? And it's like it happens beforehand. There's a few rules of like this will happen if it is a merge request. It'll only work in this project. So like these things don't get kicked off for forks, and that's for security reasons because like environment variables end up in the pipeline. And so you want to make sure that you don't allow this pipeline to get run on a forked project and have people grab all your environment variables. There's a couple of sensitive ones that we'll talk about that exist here. And then also like this, it'll also run if the branch of a commit is the default branch, which for us is main. And then, this runs like it gets a container, and you'll see we have like default setup for like we get this container. There's the node Alpine thing, the node Alpine image, right? And it gets this. Sorry, I'm scrolling around a bunch. It gets a container, and then it just runs scripts as though you were running it in a terminal. And that's a lot of what's happening in these stages. Is basically we say like, okay, provision a container, run these set of commands, move on to the next stage, or more accurately, some stages declare that they have dependencies on previous stages, right? So generally, if you have like this install stage doesn't necessarily say like isn't defined in such a way that says, okay, after you install, then you prepare. It's kind of inverted. So prepare says, do not prepare until install is done. Right. And so that's how you can get like sequential jobs. If you don't say that, these things will often run in parallel, which is also useful if you want to run things in parallel. So that's defined. This is all GitLab documentation, but that's defined in like these needs, right? So linting needs install to have happened, right? So I'll stop there. Does that kind of make sense, like as an overview of like sequencing and like where stuff is defined and how it's defined? Any questions? Cool. So we have this like prefix, and some of this has actually changed because I don't remember all of these stages necessarily, but there's a prepare stage. So we actually cache some of these dependencies to make the deployments faster, right? Especially like if nothing's changed in basically your yarn lock file, like there's no reason to like, we can just cache a node modules folder and say like, yeah, these are the node modules that work, right? So long as that lock file hasn't changed. And the rules for the caching here happen in this node push cache thing, which is in the prepare stage. And basically, it'll only cache this job. It'll only push the cache from this job to save time elsewhere. And this I grabbed from like a boilerplate actually in GitLab. So there's like more documentation around it. So that speeds things up. There's some linting we do. So I'm imagining we run ESLint and then prettier on stuff. And so that's all happening here. And there's these nice, like YAML's nice because you can comment it and sort of like be descriptive about where things are. I would guess there's some of these things you could probably clean up. I wouldn't mess with it, but you could probably make these rules like shared declarations in the YAML, just to be a little bit more like dry it up. But it's honestly, as far as CI files go, it's pretty short. It's under 300 lines. It's 252 lines counting comments. So that's really not too bad. What else? So we lint some stuff and then we build it. And so this runs, this is important. This is the thing that trips people up a lot. So like this build command, I'll show you in the YAML file. You can just see what it does. So the build stage is in the, so the build job in the build stage, maybe that's poorly named, will run after, so it requires install. And this is what it runs. It runs yarn generate. So assuming that you've pulled in Nux dependencies, it runs the command. Oh, here's, I meant to say this at the beginning. One of the cool things is, for the most part, because of the nature of our site, you can run this pipeline yourself. Like, go look at the script commands and just run them locally. And that's a really good way to debug. There are ways you can set up like a local GitLab CI instance. For our repository, that's overkill. For the most part, so long as you've got Node installed and like a couple of these shared programs like curl and stuff, like you should be able to run any of these scripts locally and just basically like locally debug what we've written in this script block. It's a really powerful thing to be able to do. The same cannot be said of every project with a GitLab CI file. Sometimes you need the CI environment. So you can run yarn generate locally, and that's what's happening. That's all that's happening here. That's the exact same thing. This is different than most people's development cycle for expediency. People will often run yarn dev in Nuxt, which starts an actual node process that serves as a server and like serves up the Nuxt files slightly differently than the static generation does. So when things are going wrong in your build step, you should not necessarily be troubleshooting against a dev server. You should be running yarn generate locally to see if you can reproduce the errors, right? That's a really important thing here. So once that happens, this is really important, and Nathan and I have like recently gone over this for a separate job. When you declare this block called artifacts, here's what's really cool is the artifacts from each one of these jobs moves along the rest of the pipeline and just as like static files. They just get like basically copy pasted over is how you can think of it. And you explicitly say like the path that is the artifacts of this is just the dist folder. So if you run yarn generate locally, you'll get this non-version controlled folder. This is also important. It's not in Git. So like these jobs will always get the full Git repository. They will not get the Git ignored files. The dist folder is Git ignored for good reason. That's conventional. So what you say is you say, okay, I have some artifacts from this job. The artifacts are everything in the dist folder. They expire in 7 days. So after a week, we discard them. That goes to any stage that depends on this job, right? Or this stage will get those artifacts in the same place. They'll get a dist folder, right? So you could just write a new job if you wanted to say like, and Nathan, I imagine you probably did this for your 404 thing, right? You write a job that depends on the build step, and your job says, okay, now I have a dist folder. Let me scrape through it to like find any broken links or like look for a particular phrase to swap it or something. So that's really important for the artifacts, and that's how that moves along. So I'll stop there. Does that make sense? Any questions?
Yeah, actually, can we go back for 1 second? Just to kind of, because if you scroll down, for the broken link one, I think you'll see that it has dependencies and it needs the install and build. And so it's taking, like you mentioned, like the node modules folder or the dist folder from those two jobs. So if you scroll up actually to the job above, it looks like it's running yarn install again. So in this case, under the test, if you look at the test
Oh
stage,
yeah, test does not need yarn install. You can just
exactly.
yarn test.
Okay, cool. So yeah,
Yeah,
if
so
you
you
could,
could speed this up by just removing this line. And so long as you make it need install, which actually I don't think it does. Like I think that's the change here. And actually I think I've seen this. So well, here's the thing though, is you may not actually get speed. So because this doesn't need anything, this actually runs in parallel. And I think I've seen this before. I've noticed this and be like, yeah, that's basically fine. But like interestingly, this basically just runs totally independent of anything else. So this like while all this stuff is happening, 1 2 3 4 5, test should also be going on its own. I might not change that. That's okay to be parallel because it's totally isolated and there's no side effects. It doesn't need anything before and it doesn't impact anything else. It will fail the pipeline if your tests fail. That's good. So you might consider like, should it fail the whole thing and stop all the other things? You could maybe save some runtime, but like we're GitLab, so like we don't pay, like I don't know, like it's art, like whatever, you're not going to save money necessarily. You save the company money, but like anyways, like how much, like it's up to, like you might do a little benchmarking, see if you pick up some improvements. But if you made this test job need install, you might actually like not see any benefits. You may even it's hard to say. I honestly you'd have to look to see what's actually faster, right?
if you click the job dependencies, does it show you kind of the job dependencies tab?
Yeah, I think it does.
Oh yeah.
There you go. So yeah, check this out. So where's
test? Test has no dependencies.
Totally isolated here.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So, yeah. So, but good call out though that like that is a choice you could make, and there might be some reason that you do that, or again, it's just something. It's like that's a good demonstration of like how you might use needs to like sequence out the jobs, because a lot of times the logic of the jobs requires a sequencing. Right. I would probably guess that scan for broken link, since build depends on install, Nathan, I would say like you might even, I don't think it really matters, but you might be able to clarify the articulation of this by only making this need build.
Yeah, because build is dependent on install. So
right, yeah. So but I don't think it matters. I don't know if there's any cost for that. It's just something to think about. And then this dependencies block, I think they might be analogous, and it might be the case that one is deprecated and one's not. I don't know for sure. This is one of those things that like go to the GitLab CI documentation. Like this CI file is like over a year old, so like things change in GitLab the product. But generally speaking, it's pretty much backwards compatible. So and there might be nuance there. These might be separate. I just don't know off the top of my head. But this is a good example to your find broken links thing. So the script is just yarn find broken links, and this is kind of nice. You can like bundle anything you can version control into like a shell script or a JavaScript. Anything can run with yarn. It's kind of nice because then you can say, like, cool, like like if yarn can do it, I can write a script that just says yarn do this thing. What it does do is it suggests that, when you see stuff like this, you should consider going into if you don't know exactly what's going on, you might consider going to the package.json file. And there is, so yarn find broken links, runs node scripts find broken links.module.js. So then you would go into the scripts file. So like if you, this is like how you dig into what's going on. Nathan knows this because he wrote this. But like, this would be like, it can be a little unclear. You'd be like, okay, like this is a one-liner, so it can obfuscate what's happening. But because it's yarn, you can use yarn to like follow the breadcrumbs and go see what's actually being executed in the container, right? So up next, because I want to focus us back on deployments, because that's sort of the major stuff here, and there's still a little bit more nuance. So then you get to the deploy stage. You see it needs build to have been done, and it also will have its own artifacts. We need that for how it's going to actually deploy. And so, where are we? Okay. So we set some variables, and basically like, there's comments here, like this variable is used in the scripts deploy bash file to switch deployment logic, and it'll create review apps. So those review apps that get named based on like the branch, this is how that happens. we give it a name, and we give it a URL, and it gets this environment variable that's the commit ref slug, which is like if you name a branch, say like git checkout -b name of my branch. In GitLab, the CI commit ref slug is name of my branch, right? And so that's the magic of review apps. That's just how this happens, right? And then we literally just move. So like the artifacts, like to get to the review app expects, just like conventionally, like any web server, typically like the public folder is sort of like what gets, if you go to the like Apache expects a public folder to be the thing that serves up your index file. So we just move just the command mv, the program mv, like dist to public, right? That's all. And then we run a deployment script. And that, again, to follow the breadcrumbs, we have a little script. And look at that, there's a deploy script here. And this is a bash script. And look, last I changed was like 9 months ago, right? And this was like we were adding some additional compression. And then so there's a bunch of comments here about stuff. There are places it can fail, and we exponentially like back off. And it's bash, which is like annoying, right? Like, if you're not always writing bash, it can be like, what is this, right? And so there's like a bash function that's just like helps you do exponential back off when things stop working. And you'll see this in the log. So like these echo statements will end up, where's my deploy? So you can go in, you can actually see what's happening here. Oh, this is the pages deployment. Pages doesn't run the script. Production deploy is the one. Yeah, a lot of copying of files. Starting deploy for production app. And this is where that variable comes in. It's like, is it production? Is it review? And then, so here's where these environment variables. So this is sort of like, this is where all the rubber meets the road. This is how it gets to the internet. Everything at about.gitlab.com is hosted on a Google Cloud bucket. That bucket is there is like an ID for it, a name for it. There's some tokens that allow us to like push to it, right? Those are all hidden in GitLab CI. I obviously won't show them on this recording, but that's how like these things are coming through here, right? And this is, again, it's like the security aspect of like that's all private, and like forks can't get access to that information. And this is really just an if-else statement, right? Like, it's like for review apps, we go to the review app buckets. For production, we go to the production buckets, and we have these different auth keys, right? And a few different, and this is all like Google command line tool specific stuff in terms of like excluding certain things. And that's the magic. The trick here is, this itself is straightforward enough to like read through bash and look up the commands of what's actually happening if you want to know like what happens on the container. The thing that is unclear and is not like immediately like obvious if you're just looking at this is that there are two repositories, two different pipelines that push to that bucket. One is the buyer experience repository. The other is the www GitLab com middleman repository. They're both sharing it, and we actually use a command. Where are we? We use rsync, and this rsync command is basically, it like is smart enough to figure out to overwrite, right, with like the most recent file. So you can, there is an order dependency here, and like each one of these repositories pipelines has the same level of access to that same bucket. We have just conventionally set it up so that they don't conflict. And basically the idea is that like in the middleman repository, there is an additional script that will pull the most recent artifacts from the most recent pipeline here and bundle it together and will redeploy. So like the buyer experience repository will always deploy its built files to the Google bucket, and those will always win and update. The middleman repository will always pull the latest. So if you were to like make an MR and buyer experience and update the homepage, that'll just happen. Like we've all seen that a million times. It just gets updated. If someone then goes and updates the handbook in the middleman repository, the homepage gets updated again, but it gets updated with the most recent build, and that's why there's an important stage here. This pages deploy has its own artifacts, and the pages job gets an API. Like there's an API request you can make to the GitLab API to get the artifacts from a particular job. And so the middleman repository just so happens to know the API endpoints to get the artifacts from this job, and it will get the most recent one. It won't make any modifications. It will just get the most recent one. It'll bundle it together. And so at the end of the day, that middleman site always rebuilds 100% of everything and pushes itself to the Google Cloud bucket. The buyer experience website does not pull in from middleman. It only pushes itself to the Google Cloud. So there's some duplication here, but like it's a safe form of duplication. The thing that bites us sometimes is that the middleman script is not smart enough. Like I think you could do this. I just didn't because it won't remove files that were removed. Right. So like it will, and there is a cleanup script somewhere, but like there is a possibility that stale files that middleman doesn't manage that get removed from buyer experience, they won't get moved. If buyer experience has like removed them, like they won't get pushed up there, but you may have to go in and actually like delete the files in some way. So there's like one scenario in which you get some stale files, and I don't think we've seen that in the last 8 months. I don't think that's actually been a problem, because but the only reason it's not a problem is because of the human processes, because we've moved so much of our development over into the buyer experience repository. If we were really splitting our efforts in both of these, we would need to be a lot smarter about these deployment processes. But for the most part, the only changes in the middleman repository that ever get made anymore are under the handbook, and the buyer experience repository has nothing for the handbook, right? So like that's like it just works that way for human processes, not for any technical reason. I think it's really important to call out that like you could get into some weird scenarios if both of these were being actively developed against the same target deployed pages, right? Like you don't want to maintain a homepage in both. Right. It's kind of important that each repository knows what pages it's responsible for. And while they're unlikely to break each other's pages, they could end up in a challenging scenario of like who wins. And like the best way to mitigate that is just never let them serve the same page.
Okay. And so I have a question for you, or a couple, I have two.
Yeah.
One of them being one day, hopefully, when buyer experience kind of migrates and the market site migrates out of the www repository, what does that migration look like? Like, can we just shut off www and everything will be fine? Or now, exactly.
No. There are, for historical reasons, the middleman repository, primarily, I think the biggest risk that you have is the redirects file, which is all handled. The thing is, the redirects file is written in, it's basically, there's a Ruby script that like, okay, I forgot there's one other step of like, so this gets deployed to Google Cloud Bucket. People don't just directly access the Google Cloud Bucket. We use Fastly as a CDN. Fastly reads from the Google Cloud Bucket and like serves up when people hit about.gitlab.com, it like serves it and it like caches it and it does all the smart things there. The original middleman repository has a bunch of utility scripts that manipulate the Fastly API. And particularly the important thing here is the redirects API. So like, I think the three of us here have probably at some point written redirects in that redirects.yaml file. You could move that logic over to the buyer experience repository. I would strongly caution that you do not. Right, because it would just be a lot of duplicative work for something that's already well understood, well documented, and working. So what I would say is you don't necessarily want to deprecate the repository, but like my vision for what that repository should be, if handbook leaves it, like if the handbook is gone and we're gone, like that repository in my mind should become basically an infrastructure as code repository that like for legacy reasons is much safer to just keep those configuration scripts in middleman, right? Like I think that's the way to do it. I mean, you know, you might conceptually disagree with me, and over time you may say like we want this all in the same place. I personally, as a person working at GitLab, I don't think there would be enough business value to justify the headaches of migration. it might feel nice, but this is one of those things where it's like that's a feeling and not like a reason. So like I think your lives will be easier if you keep it alive, because it doesn't cost too much to keep it alive, especially if handbook's out of there. And then you say, okay, like this repository is now like a dozen YAML files that like that do something that have some side effects to them, right? And then you retake it over as the team that owns that infrastructure, and that's just where you go to do it. And like again, maybe I'm wrong in a couple of years, and you really want to like streamline stuff, put it in the same place. I don't think you gain enough for that to justify the risks of migration. But again, I'm willing to be wrong on that, and it's not my problem starting Tuesday. So, but yeah, anyways, you don't just shut it off. Do not just shut it off. That is a dangerous and destructive action. I don't think anyone would do that without really thinking it through. But like, it is not just a static site deployment. It is many other things for legacy reasons. The redirects file is the biggest thing. And I will say the nice thing is if you delete it, the Fastly redirects will just stay at their current version. It will just be much harder to put in redirects. And I guess that might be another way you think about it is like, well, should we even be controlling our Fastly redirects from this YAML file? Maybe the thing we should be doing is directly interfacing with Fastly to like do that sort of configuration work. And maybe there should be some separate repository that is built where the primary use case of the repository is your Fastly configuration, and it has a set of utilities for that. That might be the way to think about it. That's up to y'all, and like teams. Like there's plenty of at that point it just becomes a decision making process. So. Anyways, I wouldn't lose a ton of sleep over it one way or another. I personally, I think I've never advocated for making that thing go away. It would never be, if I was working here for another 3 years, it would be the last thing on my list. I just like wouldn't want to do that. And I would recommend people like really interrogate if they want to do something like that, like why, like what business value are you getting to deal with all that risk and work versus just working with something that's basically fine, right? And like doesn't cost us money to have that way. So,
It's fair.
so yeah,
And they're sharing a GCP bucket, so like
yeah,
it's
it's just fine. So that's my thought. I think you should consider over time deleting, like that repository should get slimmer and slimmer.
yeah,
Right.
like uncategorized and go away.
Totally. Like those are the sorts of things. And that may even be a destructive action. You may find that you lose some web pages, but like we've talked about this before, that there's a little bit of healthy pain of like rip off the band-aid on some things and see if anyone even notices about pages that are getting basically zero traffic, right? Like that would be a thing. Like you should still like go about with some care on that decision and ask yourselves again, why are we doing this? But I do think there's actually a good business reason to like reduce the noise of like what's being maintained. Like I think that actually helps people make clearer decisions and like will help expedite like the appropriate migration to buyer experience where it ought to be, or to new handbook where it ought to be. I think that's a good idea to do. I would just, make sure you understand the implications and just like go about it somewhat carefully, and don't just rip out the whole repository.
I have one last question going back to kind of Fastly. And now we have these two repositories that are essentially just copying files over to this GCP bucket and being served by Fastly. How does Fastly know there's only one entry point when you have two? Like how does that merge together?
There's not two. Because of the way the rsync works. So if I go like at the end of the day, there's only one file that is /index.html in that bucket. And buyer experience always wins because either buyer experience repository pushes to it or the middleman repository pulls it in. This is a point of confusion though. If you run the middleman site locally, there is a homepage and it's probably 6 months out of date, because there is in fact, so this is another thing where it's like there's obfuscation happening, but it's low risk. And again, you got to ask yourself how much you care, especially if you're not in that, if we're getting out of that repository for many reasons. You might delete it. But anyways, if you run like the local middleman server, there's a homepage. That homepage does get built in the pipeline, but because the pull step, you can think of it as push and a pull. Buyer experience always pushes, never pulls. Middleman pulls buyer experience, pushes up the resulting merge. And because it pulls buyer experience after it's run the build step, and this is all in the CI pipeline for the middleman site, the index.html page that gets pushed up from the middleman job is actually the next index.html page, right? And that is the one that wins. And like this is again why like generating, and this is why doing the static generation for Nuxt is really important, because they share the same output primitives, both middleman and Nuxt, their generator steps, their static generation, only 3 types of files: HTML, CSS, JavaScript. They don't know anything about Vue. They don't know anything about React. They don't know anything about Ruby, right? They're just like plain web primitives, HTML, CSS, JS, in a file that can be statically hosted. And because of that, they can push and pull like that, and they can speak the same language at the end of the day. Like the Nuxt files are just index.html, and then there's JavaScript bundles, and there's like some conventional stuff about like, but at the end, but like it's all convention around these 3 technologies that both of these programs understand how to output, right? So that's why that works. That's the beauty of the static site generation. And so if you wanted to move away from doing static site generation, these things could not live as nicely together. You would have a lot more complex deployments to say, like if you're doing partially static and like partially like server-side rendering, right? Like that's just a whole different architecture, right? And if you do find that you're going down the server-side rendering route for reasons, then you might consider like just dropping all support for middleman. Like I wouldn't try to shoehorn in that process, but you'd also have to like understand that you're basically totally divergent. Like what we did a year ago when we put together this pipeline was we said, what we want to do is we want to stop like having to play by the middleman rules and do things the middleman way. We wanted to lean into a JavaScript first way to get to that static site output. And because we agreed that we would still be doing static site generation, that opened up the avenue to maintain these sort of like these 2 repos pushing to the same target. And so that's a huge virtue and allowed us to move very quickly. We did this project in like 2 or 3 months total. Like I think we did it in a quarter, and then it just works. And it's just, people don't like, I don't even think about it anymore. So like it's really, really good. And then if you're changing the architecture, you like you lose that. You don't lose it entirely, but like to keep that backwards compatibility, you have to do a lot of extra work, and you might consider just a clean break, right? If you're thinking about static side, server side rendering, which is different than the static generation. There's a good reason to do server-side rendering. There's a lot of performance benefits, right? There's also sort of like a cultural shift back to server-side rendering. There's some good tooling, very particular, we're doing more and more A/B testing, and all of our A/B testing has to be done on the client side, and that's like a performance hit for us. It's not great. And server-side rendering would allow you to do A/B testing at the server level and like not experience the same client side performance hit, right? But it's also like more expensive. It's like there's a lot more moving pieces. Like you can't just slap up a server, but our traffic is such that like you can't just provision one server and do server side rendering. Like you need a lot more. So I think I wouldn't mess with what's working, but there are limitations. And I think the A/B testing is one of the places where we really see a lot of the limitations, and even like some of the Vue stuff we're doing is like a limitation to the static site, to the static rendering. Like there's a couple of places, but like we made those trade-offs a long time ago, and they've been reevaluated annually for years, and it almost always comes out ahead that like doing this is the appropriate choice for what this website is. And I would be shocked to find that like that wasn't the case in the next 2 to 3 years. But again, not my problem. If someone else feels strongly like, don't watch this video and think that you're wrong. You obviously like, if you're watching this in even 2 weeks time, you officially know more about like what's going on than I do. So like, use your best judgment, but like maybe this will caution you from architectural changes. So do you feel like we covered everything? Do you have any like other questions, either specific or general?
I think I'm good from my end.
Yeah. Miracle?
Miracle, do you have anything?
Well, like the overview was great. Like you were answering my questions as we were going through them. So
Great. Yeah. Like I said, I don't expect, this is another thing, like as a yellow flag, right? Like if you find that you're making a lot of changes here, you should ask yourself why. Like this, the last time I touched the deploy script was 9 months ago. for I think what was a one-liner change. And before that, it would have been like 12 months ago. Like, it should kind of feel easy. It should kind of feel like magic. I think it's one of like I'm very proud of it because it has served us well over a tremendous amount of growth, both in terms of like team size and scope of website. So like if you find that something is weird about the deployment, like I would be shocked to find that this is your real problem. You might be approaching and this, and again, like to go back to like A/B testing, like A/B testing doesn't work well with this, right? And like if you like that is something where you might say like I'm having a hard time getting the A/B test to perform the way I expect them to using our deployment process. The answer is not to like make this deployment process more complex. It is not to generate the site 3 different times and deploy them to 3 different like you could do that. That is not the answer. I'll give you the hint. That's not the answer. Like I feel pretty strongly about that. That is a moment where you have to ask yourself, like, you know, do the benefits of doing A/B testing through server-side rendering like outweigh the cost of like changing the arc? Like there are just some things that are easier to do with different architectures than others. Like that's why you make these choices. We weren't doing much A/B testing at all when we made this decision. So like if that turns into like the primary thing that we're doing on this website, I could see that the team might say like we need a server that can resolve these A/B tests and like ship these variants like on a smart computer really fast and serve that without making people's browsers do a fetch request to find out which version of what text to put in a button, right? I think that's actually a totally valid thing. I would never expect someone to be able to solve that problem in the deploy script. I guess never say never, but like that, I just think you're barking up the wrong, like again, this should feel easy to work with, right? You should be able to be like, oh, like we talk about like, oh, maybe your test script, maybe you do want it to depend, maybe you don't want it to depend, maybe you want to change where your artifacts go, maybe you want to like try a quick optimization on a thing or two, or like you want to add a script to verify some output. That stuff should generally feel pretty smooth to do. It should feel, and Nathan, I think you can speak to this of your 404 checker. It didn't feel like you were swimming upstream, right? It's like you write the 404 checker, you put in a job, you kind of like look at how the other stuff is structured, and you try it once or twice, you clean up any weird bugs, and then it lives, right? And it's working. So it should feel like that. If it feels harder than that, I think you might need to rethink what you're doing.
Yeah, 100% agree. At the end of the day, like we have a static site. We don't have any like user data. We have no API. And so I don't see a need to ever switch to server side, even for just A/B testing. I think we can get away with it.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, like I hate to say it, but it's simple. Like we have a simple site. We have almost like a textbook, go on like Code Academy and do a static site, whatever.
The one thing that
end up with the same thing.
Yeah, I'll disagree with you in one aspect, which I think will change over time. I think that our website, this website, is particularly the middleman, a little bit less the buyer experience, but like we are pushing the limits of the build times. Like if you think about the sweet spot for static site generation, I think that we are well beyond the number of pages and sub pages and like components and stuff where like to some degrees, like changes in like server-side rendered websites, like we have such a volume of content that like I think you're beyond the ideal scenario for a static site generator. But that was true 2 years ago when I joined, and it's getting better as we like scope down what the website does. But this is the thing where you need to be careful because like this iteration of this team has in their heads, like culturally, that like we're trying to scope down the website into a smaller use case. It is I could see someone in a year when things change that the scope is expanding. And if the scope starts to expand, there's going to be like a much stronger case for not doing static site generation. And I think that if we hadn't done this thing to like run away from the middleman site and we hadn't been on a mission to like reduce the number of pages middleman spit out, that like we had for years been basically beyond the tipping point of how much time it made sense of how many pages it made sense to statically generate, because there's like 13,000 or something like that. And I think that's well in the middleman site, and I think that's well beyond any happy path. And even the creator of middleman, you can go and like Google this about like GitLab has been in conversation with middleman because they're open source and we love them and they're great. And I think there's like even a comment thread where like the creator of Middleman was like, whoa, like I did not mean for an 8,000 page website to be running on my thing. And I think that like that's important context. It's something to think about. And I think Nuxt had some benefits. There's some incremental regeneration. There's some approaches around it, but like there are trade-offs to static site generation, and one of them is if you have a ton of dynamically generated content and you know it's going to grow, you might start thinking about a different approach. I don't anticipate that for this team, but like if someone is watching like years later of this video, that would be a thing to think about.
So when we think about the blog and we think about the release posts, we're looking at thousands of additional pages. Like, is that something you think Nuxt could handle? Or is that,
I don't know. It's like it's so much on the it's like towing the line in so many ways that like because like what you really don't want to do though is have like a static site and then also this like server side. Like it's kind of like you kind of want to pay the price there, and it's I don't know. I don't know. Oh no, I do know. What I might consider is another static site generator that's like another next thing that like the way like that doesn't get built every time this website gets built, because presumably blog and release posts have a totally different release cycle, and so like they only need to update when they update. You don't need like you shouldn't necessarily rebuild your whole blog folder historically every time you update the homepage, but that is what we do. Right? Like, or well, no, because it's a middleman. But if you move blog over, that's what would happen. So you might consider like a third repository. Like you might actually consider splitting it up and saying, this is the blog repository, keep it on Nuxt, keep them in sync as they're using the same technology, but like their build step is differently. Or you don't even need a separate repository. Actually, you could like, sorry, this is, it gets more, it's like every one of these things is like the cleverer it is, the more complex it is, and the harder it is to like keep it maintained. But like imagine that you cached it, or you could even say like you even have the blog generation step. So one repository, you change your yarn generate command to use different ignore files, and you say like, okay, yarn generate blog only generates all the blog posts. Yarn generate generates everything but the blog posts. And in the GitLab CI, you can actually see what files changed, and you can use like file like lobbing paths. And so you can say, oh, generally use yarn generate. You have to make sure that you keep a latest blog, right? You have to like, it's like yarn generate and then go make a curl request to like the latest artifacts, the last good run of a blog, pull down all the, oh, you don't even need to do that because it's all living on the Google Cloud bucket. Yeah, you don't need to do that because it's all just there in your Google Cloud. So just generate all the new stuff, like skip the blog, push all the new stuff up. All the GCP Google Cloud storage stuff is like still there. You only need to overwrite the blog files when blog changes. But again, but you're moving away from the convention. So like you're not just running yarn generate. You're running two new commands that are not directly supported by Nuxt. You're like configuring. You're configuring away from your convention, and that's like a that like sure you can write a markdown file about it, but then everyone needs to know that markdown file exists. Right, like you start to add a bunch of questions, and so you have to ask you like you might benchmark how long does it take for blog posts to get generated? Is it 30 seconds? Is it 2 minutes? If it's 2 minutes, might be worth it. 30 seconds, maybe not, but it is going to grow. So I think those are questions to ask yourselves. You have a lot of options, and they range from like many additional projects and like a complexity of the like a breadth complexity of like all the different projects you have to a depth complexity of the very like niche things you're doing inside one place. And I don't know if there's a third way that gets you away from complexity, right? It's just like I think you have to choose which type of complexity is the right choice for the team.
well, yeah, I think that's it for
Cool.
me. For questions. I know we've been going for a while. Is there anything else we want to kind of add at the end here before signing off, or do we think we got everything? Do we think we drained all Tyler's
all my lifeblood?
I have an open question. Is there anything that, and I mean, like, you might not know the answer right now, but like, is there anything that you can think of that like in 6 months we're gonna say, man, we wish we had Tyler to like ask this question?
Yeah, you're gonna want to know how to uninstall my crypto miner. No, that's a good question. No, this is the one thing that I was on my mind for the most part. Most of the work that I've done in the last 8 months has actually been outside of this repository, working on like Google Analytics in the product, working on some like A/B testing a little bit, and like yeah, I think this was the biggest thing where I was like, I don't know if I've ever really sat down and talked with someone about it. I have written it down. I think you could go find, there's documentation on this. It might be a little stale, but also this hasn't changed much. So like, it wouldn't even be that stale. This is the answer to your question. Like this conversation is that. I think everyone else on the team has done much more in terms of the actual pages and components than I have in a long time. Like I think those things the teams have done a really good job of like, expanding the responsibilities to new people, and people have done a really excellent job with it. So I think this is maybe the last bastion of like what lives in my head and what I think people would want me around for. There is stuff in the product. There's an additional answer, which is the stuff that we did all the Google Analytics instrumentation for in the product. And I think that's going to be tricky to detangle because like our team doesn't have a ton. Like I've spent time, Miracle, with you, with Javi, with Lauren, like with Justin. Like I've spent time talking with folks, but like it's just like not the core thing that our team does. And so I think there's like a real challenge of like figuring out how much more this team works in that code base. And like, yeah, I think that's the real thing. But it's, the nice thing, and to some degree, is like, it's also not this way. Like neither of you are necessarily responsible for that, right? So like for your day-to-day, no, but for like the broader team question of like those analytics, I think like that's a harder question to answer. I don't have the answer to, even if I was sticking around for 6 months, I think it's a business risk to be in there anyways with just like 1 or 2 people on this team who have the expertise to do so. So like, I think it's always been a problem. And I don't know what the real answer is. So. Cool. Good luck. You'll need it. You'll be fine. It'll be fine. No, I think it should hum along pretty smoothly for you. And I credit that to like good product in GitLab, right? GitLab made this easy to do. So.
Well, thanks again for having this video and sitting down and chatting with us, but also for setting up that Nuxt repo in the past.
Yeah, that was fun. It was a fun time. I had a good time doing it, and I'm just like I said, I'm very proud. Like I'm very personally proud of like where it's gone and how useful it's been for people, and just like it just kind of works. Like that's why I want to bring this up is like we've had so few problems with it that like no one's ever had to troubleshoot it. That like I always expected other people to jump in and help out, but there's been almost nothing to do because it's been great. But it doesn't mean that it'll always just work for you, right? Like you'll the container images you use, right, are pinned to node 16. So when you upgrade past that, like you'll need to think about updating those things. Oh, there's one tricky thing. Yes, yeah. I'm glad there's one tricky thing. There's a note about this. Our deployment image. Hold on, let me.
Or are they different between?
There's one image that you gotta be careful of. In your deployment image, look at this comment. This is important. There's a couple MRs linked to it, but basically, we use GSUtil, which is a Google Cloud utility. We use a patched version of it that one of the staff engineers at GitLab patched, and that's baked into this image. We could make our own image, but basically like here's like the www GitLab repo like image. This image is required for our deployment for like one particular type of command. And there's some MRs you can dig through to see the why. This will basically always be stable, but this is a thing to watch out for, and that's why there's a 4-line comment around it. So like just like your deployment image is not just a node Alpine image, right? But it's only for the deployment job. Everything else can be done in node.
And this is because of middleman?
No, this is for other reasons. This is because of Google Cloud utilities and like there's an option basically like what you should be able, so ideally this image for deployment, because we only use the Google Cloud SDK, you should actually be able to use the Docker image. That's the Google Cloud SDK. You should even just be able to use latest. But we use because we want to gzip the files for performance reasons, Stan had to patch the gsutil package to allow for a particular argument to be passed in. Right. And to use that patched gsutil, we can't use Google Cloud SDK latest. This patch gsutil is just being pulled into here. It doesn't have to be pulled into here. You could pull in that patch to another custom image. I never wanted to mess with it because it kind of just works. But like this image itself has like, it has like Ruby into it and a couple other things that just don't get used. The thing that matters is this patched gsutil file, and there are specific MRs that point to the patching. The other thing you could do too is like if Google ever patches gsutil to pass that flag appropriately, you should be able, like the ideal state is eventually you come back and you swap out this registry.gitlab.com link for Google/Cloud SDK latest. That's what you want to do. But until that day, just be careful. Don't mess with this.
But I'm assuming this is like doc site. Like this is not just us that's using this image. Like
I don't know. I don't know.
Oh, okay. Fun. Okay.
So that may be a point of investigation. That's another one of those. It's kind of just like that's a little bit of duct tape holding things together. That like I wouldn't remove that. I just wouldn't want to mess with it. So it's like I just don't think there's a lot of value for the business to be gained by like it works. It works fine. We know why it's working. That might be a pet project you do in your like 10% improvement time, but even that there's like some risk there. So yeah, so okay, that's the last thing. Cool. Anything else?
No, thank you.
Cool. All right, I'm gonna stop the recording. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being here.